Why do we create art? From painting and music to anything we make with the intention of making someone feel, art is a broad term. However, when it comes to stories, the question of why we create becomes easier. In front of you are 4 stories that I personally consider to be masterpieces. Now, if I asked you which stories you'd label as such, which ones would you pick? And what would that say about who you are? I believe that whether reader or writer, answering this question doesn't just explain why we create stories, it explains why certain ones stay with us and what masterpieces reveal about yourself. By definition, a masterpiece is a work of outstanding skill or artistry, but in simple terms, it's just a hell of a banger, a really good story. But what is it that makes a good story? Heck, what even is a story? From the very beginning, humans have used stories to make sense of the world. Think mythology. Before science, we explained thunder, love, fate, even death through narrative. Our brains are wired for story, not just as entertainment, but as survival tools. Stories helped us predict danger, pass down wisdom, and understand human behavior. And the reason they've persisted to this day is simple. When we consume a story, our minds don't just watch it, they simulate it. Character struggles feel like our own, and sometimes they even shift how we see ourselves or others. But more on that later, because at the heart of every story lies conflict. A character who wants something, facing obstacles, and being forced to grow or collapse. So, what makes a good story? Writers use certain tools like tropes, character shifts, extremes colliding, stakes rising until someone's true nature bursts out, etc. Those are factors that can make a story better. And then, of course, there are so-called objective metrics, like pacing that doesn't drag, characters that act consistently, themes that actually hold together, and setups that pay off. You can think of them as boxes critics tick when they call a story well written. But the thing is, none of that explains why one person calls a show mid while another swears it's peak. And to get to that answer, we need to clear up 2 big misconceptions. If you know a bit about writing, you've probably heard that stories have a core theme from which everything else derives, something you resonate with. For Death Note, you might say justice or morality, while for Berserk, maybe struggle, loneliness, or vengeance would be more befitting. Even entire arcs can be labeled this way. And if that sounded like it made sense, let me tell you that that was a lie, because a theme isn't just a topic. For this video, I'm going to define a theme as a specific question that the story is built around, a question the characters and plot are forced to explore. That's what makes a story feel cohesive and powerful, and the best thematic questions share 3 traits. They're specific, debatable, and difficult. Not something obvious like, is murder evil, but questions with multiple stances, shades of gray, and no easy answers. Take Death Note for example. The surface level theme might seem like, do the ends justify the means? But that's still too vague. Push it a bit deeper and you get sharper questions, like can a human wield godlike power without being corrupted? Or can one person justly act as the sole judge and executioner of the world if the results look good? Now, I'm not the writer of Death Note, so I can't tell you the exact questions they had in mind, but the story itself gives us the answer it leans toward. It disproves the utopia Light wants to create. Light starts with criminals, but then quickly justifies killing FBI agents, Lind L. Taylor, and eventually anyone who gets in his way. His empathy shrinks, his power isolates him, and his ego balloons, the very flaw that ultimately destroys him. L even tells him, and thereby us, the audience, the one who is just will win.
Anyway, we shouldn't be arguing about it. Good or evil, it's not our call. All we have to think about is catching him. If Kida gets caught, then that makes him evil. But if he wins and rules the world, then I guess he's justice.
and at first it looks like light wins, but the story continues because we, the audience, still haven't seen the true verdict. We haven't gotten our message yet. I know this is kind of a side tangent, but it also shows why a democracy doesn't function by putting all power in one person's hands. The law isn't entrusted to just one person or party, it's divided across three: the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative. And the reason for that separation is simple, so that power isn't monopolized. If one branch gets corrupt or loses its way, the other two still exist to step in and restore balance. Death Note plays out the exact opposite scenario. One person becomes judge, jury, and executioner, and we see clearly what happens when absolute power is given to a single hand. But whether you like the ending or not, it's safe to say that Death Note is widely remembered as a masterpiece. It asks a hard, debatable question and gives a clear but dramatic answer. And that's the difference. Justice, fate, and identity, these are all subjects, but a theme is always a question. The second misconception that people have is that a masterpiece is always perfect. Think about it like a student in physics class. From his perspective, the teacher is basically infallible, a master of the craft. Why? Because the kid doesn't know enough yet to see the flaws. But if that same student dedicates his life to physics, over time he might start spotting oversimplifications in what his high school teacher once taught him. That's the same dynamic between an author and a reader. If you're new to consuming stories or just don't pay much attention to them, every big twist or emotional scene feels like peak fiction because you don't have the tools to critique it yet. That's why so many people call Solo Leveling peak. From their perspective, it is, but as your media literacy grows, and yeah, I don't really like that word either, you start to notice issues: an underdeveloped cast, shallow themes, cliches, and suddenly what once felt perfect now feels flawed. But here's the thing, that doesn't mean those people are necessarily wrong. It just means a masterpiece isn't defined by being flawless, it's defined by how deeply it resonates in that moment. Recognizing this lifts a huge burden off your shoulders. You don't need to pretend a story has zero flaws. You don't need to act like an author is some half-god who wrote divine perfection or step into some objective critic role. A masterpiece can stumble and still change your life. And if people still defend flawed stories as if they're perfection, that's not just them being ignorant, it's them defending a core part of themselves. So now that these two misconceptions are cleared, we can finally ask, what actually makes a story a masterpiece? And I'll give you two different answers. The first one is simple. A masterpiece is any story that leaves a permanent mark on you. And the second one is what this entire section is about. But before we get into it, can you hear that? Tell me, what did that just now make you feel? And no, I'm not asking you for an objective breakdown of the lyrics, the instruments, or the melody. That kind of analysis only tells us whether the soundtrack is technically good. What I'm asking is way simpler. What did it make you feel? Maybe it made you cry, maybe it made you smile, maybe you didn't feel anything at all. And all three answers are valid. Let me know in the comments down below. But for me, it instantly takes me back to the winter of 2020, back when I was pulling all-nighters studying for an entrance exam. Now, that's oddly specific and personal, but here's why I brought it up. Do you have any tracks that remind you of a certain stage in your life? An anime opening, an OST, or even just a random song or album? And if so, would you call that song a masterpiece? Because that right there shows two things. First, how much more weight the subjective factors, what a piece made you feel, carry compared to the objective ones. And second, how much nostalgia can distort our opinion of certain stories. Nostalgia isn't just remembering the past, it's reliving it. It's triggered by sensory cues, and when it hits, you aren't just recalling a moment, you're stepping back into the you that existed back then. That's why rewatches, headcanons, fan art, and even fanfictions feel so powerful. They don't just revive the story, they revive the identity you had when you first lived through it. In stories, these cues usually come in two forms, auditory and visual. Visually, it's the art art style, color palette, or animation. Auditory cues are often even stronger. Sound design and especially music. Neuroscience backs this up. Memory and emotion are tightly linked with the amygdala and hippocampus heavily involved, which is why a single track can collapse years of your life into a few seconds of sound. Think of Attack on Titan. By season 4, it didn't just feel different because of plot or pacing or the studio changing. The thick outlines were gone, the vibrant colors were muted, and Linked Horizon was no longer doing the openings. We got Ashes on Fire instead of Vogel im Käfig, and for many, even though I could just be talking about myself, that broke the nostalgic tie. The earlier vibe was inseparable from those specific sensory cues, and sound design works the same way. Do I really need to explain? What's happening is simple. Sensory cues stamp themselves onto our identity, and later when you hear or see them again, you don't just recall the story, you re-inhabit the person you were. Sometimes because you miss that version of yourself, and sometimes because it might have been a growth period you can't return to. This also explains why stories feel so personal. A song, an OST, or a visual can lock in a rhythm, a pattern. The first time your brain processes that rhythm, it saves everything around it too. What you felt, what you were going through, and even who you thought you were. That's why two people can watch Death Note and come away with completely different reads. One sees a psycho criminal while another sees an intelligent, justice-driven student. Everyone basically reads a slightly different story because the lens from which they consume it is different. Dare I say, unique. It's also why nostalgia tends to hit harder with shows than with movies. In a series, the same OSTs or visual motifs repeat across weeks or months, fusing the story with your daily life. That longer exposure makes the identity stamp even stronger. It explains that nostalgia distorts how we judge stories. It's why people call shows underrated even when they clearly aren't. AOT is one of the biggest anime in the world, with awards, cultural impact, etc., and yet fans still swear it's underrated because what they really mean is my version of AOT, the one that got me through high school, that lonely summer, or the 13 years of my life, feels invisible to the masses. Nobody else experienced that vibe because nostalgia is like a file. It smooths the rough edges of the past. Your life looks sweeter, and so does the story. Plot holes, bad pacing, awkward dialogue, you barely notice them anymore. What remains is the shine of how it once made you feel. This overlaps with the IKEA effect. We don't just consume a story, we build it into ourselves. We invest our time, the most valuable asset we have, and that investment makes it feel uniquely ours. So nostalgia is the stamp, and a story's vibe is the stamp pad that imprints onto you. Together they explain why you might defend a flawed show like scripture. You're not defending the flaws, you're defending the past self who lived with it. And it also explains things like post-anime depression or post-game emptiness, but we'll get to that later. By vibe, I mean the essence of a story, the unique feeling that makes it instantly recognizable as itself. It's the way all the parts work together. The art style, sound design, the animation, color palette, or the OSTs. That's why vibe is what makes something subjectively good. You can't reduce it to just one factor because it's the total effect. As the YouTuber Bubble Tea pointed out in the timeless nostalgia of Kingdom Hearts, it's not really about nostalgia for the game itself, it's about the memories and feelings you carry with it. The vibe of a story fuses those emotions with the craft in a way that can still feel deep and relevant years later. It's also why two shows with nearly identical plots can feel completely different, or why rewatching the same series years later doesn't hit the same. The vibe has changed because you have changed. The lens from which you consume the story is different. And at the heart of vibe aren't just the visuals or the soundtracks. What really defines a story's essence are the two things we actually live through as an audience. And the first is the world we step into. While world building is important, it isn't really my strength, so I just want to touch on it briefly. People often assume good world building means creating an ultra detailed airtight system where every single detail makes sense, but that's not always the case. What actually matters is whether the world invests you. Does it make you want to step inside, to live in it, or at least to explore it through the eyes of the characters? Take Harry Potter. The series is full of contradictions and rough edges if you really start pulling at the logic of the world, but that didn't stop it from becoming one of the most popular stories of all time. An entire generation grew up loving Harry Potter. Why? Because the world was immersive. Everyone who read the books or watched the movies wanted to be a student at Hogwarts at some point. It blended fantasy and realism so well that people could picture themselves inside of it. The feeling that an unknown underground society was present in our world just made the stories so magnetic. And this shows another misconception. A world doesn't need to be flawless either. It doesn't need to be perfect. But as much as worlds can immerse us, they aren't enough on their own. If world building makes you want to visit a story, characters make you want to stay. The deeper question isn't do you want to live in this world, but do you want to be with these characters, or even be one of them? This is where security characters come into play, and at first glance, Evangelion and tragedies in general for that matter seem to completely contradict what I just said. You don't want to live in that apocalyptic world. You don't necessarily want to be by Shinji's side, and you definitely don't want to be him, but you can still relate to him. His identity crisis, his self-hate, his constant indecision. Those are all deeply human struggles. Shinji perfectly embodies the versions of ourselves that keep telling us that the world doesn't understand us, that everything is against us. We see a part of ourselves in Shinji. Part of what makes Evangelion so suffocating is that every relationship Shinji has is transactional. Misato, who at first looks like a caring guardian, uses him to fill her own loneliness and pursue revenge. Asuka, who projects confidence, leans on him as an ego boost. And his own father, well, I think it's self-explanatory. Everywhere Shinji turns, the message is the same. You're not accepted for who you are, only for what you can give. But then Kaoru appears, and suddenly, for the first time, Shinji feels safe. Kaoru provides the security that nobody else in his life ever did. Compared to everyone else who used Shinji as a means to an end, Kaoru's presence is unconditional. And hang on, I'll get into that in a sec. And what makes it hit even harder is that Shinji sees in Kaoru the version of himself he wishes he could be. Kaoru is, in a sense, Shinji's ideal self, the person he could become if he were free, as stated in an interview. But wouldn't the name Nagisa Kaoru fit even a girl? But that's a young man. There's no feminine sense whatsoever, right? Because it's Shinji and another Shinji. Since it's an ideal of Shinji's that's appearing, it can't be a girl. It est if Shinji could remake himself over into the perfect person, he would be exactly like Kaoru. And when you dig deeper, Shinji and Kaoru are basically two sides of the same coin in Jungian psychology. Shinji embodies the persona, the mask he wears to gain approval. When asked why he pilots the Eva, he answers, because everyone tells me to. He's defined by expectation and validation. Kaoru, on the other hand, is the shadow, the repressed self Shinji wishes he could be, free, confident, unburdened. That's why Ano himself said Kaoru is another Shinji. He isn't just a friend, he's Shinji's unlived self. And remember back then when I said unconditional presence? Yeah, when I say that, I literally mean it. Love that doesn't depend on any condition to be met. As humans, we can't truly do that. Even when we think we love someone unconditionally, there are always hidden factors, hidden conditions. Their kindness, the way they look or sound, their thoughts, the tiny habits or actions or inconsistencies that make them them. If those conditions disappear one by one, the love fades. It's always relative, and that is neither good nor bad, it's just reality. But Kaoru isn't bound by human selfishness, and that's why his acceptance of Shinji is absolute. Shinji is, and therefore Kaoru loves, and whatever Shinji is up to him. As mentioned earlier, Kaoru represents what Shinji could become if he were able to get past his insecurities and limiting beliefs. Maxwell Marshall Maltz put it best: you will act like the sort of person you conceive yourself to be. Shinji conceives himself as unworthy, broken, and unlovable, and so he acts that way. But Kaoru flips that script. He shows Shinji that simply existing is enough to be loved, no conditions required. This becomes even more striking when you remember Shinji grew up without his mother, and Kaoru outright says that he and Rei are the same, and Rei herself is a clone of Shinji's mother. In that sense, Kaoru doesn't just represent acceptance, he becomes a symbolic stand-in for the unconditional love Shinji was denied from the start. And yeah, I know it might not make sense narratively with the whole Adam and Lilith plotline, but it does make perfect sense symbolically. If there's any human bond we associate with unconditional love, it's between a mother and her child. The only condition there is that the child is hers, and even that was taken away from Shinji, leaving him desperate for a love without strings attached, something Kaoru finally gives him.
Humans live with a constant feeling of pain inside of their hearts, but their hearts are sensitive to pain, so it makes living difficult. Their hearts are delicate like glass, yours especially.
His grace doesn't require Shinji to become anything. His love has no conditions. And for a fleeting moment, Evangelion's oppressive atmosphere lifts. Shinji finally knows what it feels like to be loved without needing to earn it. And just before Shinji has time to fully comprehend that love in the cruel logic of tragedy, it's ripped away from him. From then on, we see an even more broken Shinji, one that has to decide whether to advance or to retreat in a world that only ever hurt him.
You, for example, are simply unused to what it is to be liked by others.
You've never learned how to deal with fearing what others feel about you, and so you avoid it.
But don't the others hate me?
What are you, stupid? Haven't you realized it's all in your imagination, you mega dork?
But sometimes it isn't just one person who gives you that comfort. It can also be a group. At the beginning of Attack on Titan, the 104th Cadet Corps gave many viewers a sense of belonging, even though nobody would actually want to live in that brutal world. Back when I was a clueless 14-year-old, I would have given anything just to sit at that dinner table with the other cadets, and obviously I completely regret those thoughts. The same with the Straw Hats in One Piece. Their bond makes you feel like part of the crew, even if the pacing drags or the arcs stumble. And for people who feel introverted or isolated in real life, that kind of surrogate family hits even harder. Your nervous system cannot tell the difference between an imagined and a real experience. It's the same reason your heart races when you face an underprepared boss fight in Hollow Knight. Your brain knows you're safe behind a screen, but your body still reacts like it's real. That dates back to primal times, when anticipating a saber-toothed tiger or any other threat behind a bush triggered the same survival response. This blurring of reality is what makes characters such powerful sources of security. When you see the Straw Hats gathered around a campfire, laughing and eating together, your brain doesn't just say, "That's nice." It lights up the same neural pathways as if you were sitting there yourself. And if you don't have much of that sense of belonging in real life, whether because you're introverted, isolated, or just going through a lonely phase, that effect gets amplified. Fictional bonds step in where real ones are missing. They make you feel like you belong, even if it's only for 20 minutes an episode. And in that sense, stories don't just entertain us, they patch holes in our emotional reality. I think we can all agree that a feeling from our childhoods we'll never forget is the excitement for adventure. That sense of wonder, stepping into an unknown world with endless possibilities, is the spark certain stories chase, and the spark that defines why we fall in love with them. And when I think about adventure in storytelling, no series captures it quite like Hunter x Hunter. The world building alone is enough to make you want to get lost in it. From the Hunter exam's bizarre trials and the airship that whisks you into strange new lands, to Heaven's Arena with its vertical city of battles, to the mafia underworld of York New, to NGL, and even the looming Dark Continent, every arc feels like a new frontier. But if I had to choose one arc that crystallizes everything we've been talking about thus far: vibe, world building, characters, nostalgia, it has to be Greed Island. Now, I know that this is unconventional. Most fans point to Chimera Ant for its darkness and philosophical weight, or York New for its intensity. But for me, Greed Island is the arc that crystallizes everything we've been talking about, all in one. Not only is it Togashi's love letter to MMORPGs and card games, but also it feels like the kind of world I dreamed of as a kid, and honestly, one I wish I could have stepped into myself. And it's not just the setting. This is where Gon and Killwa's dynamic shines brightest, before the cracks that Chimera Ant would later force open. With Biscuit acting as their mentor, the two level up together, training, battling, and growing side by side. It's the whole detour notion that Jing touches on towards the end of the anime. Masterpieces don't always need tragedy to shape you. Sometimes joy itself can become the teacher. Male loneliness is something we don't talk about enough, and I think that's why this arc hits so deeply. Watching two friends have fun in a world that feels both fantastical and believable scratches an itch real life often can't. It's relaxing, adventurous, full of camaraderie. The ending theme Reason, which later fittingly plays when Gon and Killua part ways, instantly burned itself into my memory. That wasn't random. The directors knew the song had imprinted itself as the sound of their friendship, of their peak dynamic. Hearing it again doesn't just remind me of the arc, it revives the feeling of growing alongside them and going on these adventures with them. The feeling of friendship at its purest, that bittersweet sense of joy and belonging despite knowing that you can never truly be there, is why vibe matters. It fuses with who you were when you first watched it. But beneath the lighter tone, there's still a theme being explored. The game is designed to exploit greed. With its limited cards, strict rules, and manufactured scarcity, that tension is embodied in Genthru. He may not be the series' most iconic villain, but his selfish, shortcut-driven approach makes him the perfect foil to Gon in this arc. Where Gon treats the game as an adventure, Genthru reduces it to pure extraction, seeing other players as tools or obstacles. His entire philosophy crystallizes in that moment when Gon tells Killua, "I want to play this game the right way, the way Jing intended it to be," partly also because he wants to rise to the expectations of his father, because he wants to become a hunter, a person worthy of his father's respect and admiration, a feeling that we, the audience, while not as extreme as Gon, still know. And that exact moment is where, for me, Greed Island opens the door to something bigger, because the reason masterpieces leave an imprint isn't just the worlds they create, it's how they reflect us back at ourselves. Stories don't just entertain, they let us test who we are. Look at Chimera Ant, its core question: what does it mean to be human? It gets answered in the cruelest way possible. Gon's thirst for vengeance, something we might admire at first as justice, transforms him into a monster. Meanwhile, Pito, a literal monster, finds humanity in her final moments through empathy, care, and devotion to her king. Or Kurapika, once a moral compass, shows how kindness rots into obsession once chained to revenge. Without fiction, you'd never see these extremes play out so vividly. Or Killua, his arc of breaking free from his family's control isn't just a shonen power-up, it's the suffocating weight of expectations from parents, teachers, societies, peers, all of it pressing down. His growth is the lesson, learning to be honest about what he wants and finding out what he actually wants in the first place, even if it disappoints others. That truth is obviously exaggerated in the story, but the underlying reality is painfully familiar. And also his attachment to Gon and eventually being able to break free from it. Sometimes characters reveal sides of themselves even they didn't know they had, and in those moments we discover that's true of us too. Through fiction, one lifetime expands into dozens. You live deaths that leave you hollow, arcs that drag with emptiness, defeats that crush you, triumphs that make you euphoric, and all of that ties back perfectly to Hunter x Hunter's large thesis. It's about the journey and not the destination.
Enjoy the side trips. A lot, okay? Things that are more important than what you're hunting for could be right there by the side of the road.